this morning. It is an absolutely gorgeous day in central Ohio, which right now we got to celebrate, right? You only get a few of those right now. It might be raining tomorrow. You never know. But we are so glad that everyone could be here. And we're going to start a new teaching series today. We finished up our Breathe series last week. And today we're going to start this thing called Encountering Jesus. And some of the thoughts behind this, I was thinking about meeting celebrities. Anybody here ever met someone relatively famous? Anyone? Okay. I know famous is relative in and of itself, but there's something about celebrities that we tend to get a little excited about, or we love to meet them. People start name dropping, right? Oh, I met this, or when I was hanging out with whomever. I do remember one weekend, I'm going to name drop just a little bit, but when I was in children's ministry many moons ago, did anybody here old enough to remember the show 8 is Enough? Okay, you know the youngest, was it Willie Ames? Is that his name? Anyway, he became Bible Man teaching in a video series, and I was at a children's ministry conference, and he and I hung out for the weekend. It was pretty cool. I know, that's the depth of my name dropping, but in all this, the thing is that what I've noticed is our culture, and just I think human nature, is that when we encounter someone that's influential, or is that a lot of people know them, or they seem to have some power somewhere or something, we tend to enjoy that. We always talk about how did we interact with that person, right? How did that person like us? Why do you think marketers use famous people to sell products? Because we listen. Even if they're stupid people, it doesn't matter. If they're famous, we're dumb enough to buy stuff just because their face is on it. And so we understand that. We see that just within human nature. And when you think about Jesus, if you go back and you read through the Gospels, you can see over and over that Jesus had become a pretty famous guy. I mean, he was a celebrity in his day, and this was, pre-internet, pre-TV, pre-radio, they didn't have any. So the word of him spread. You can see it at multiple places, but Matthew 9:31 talks about how the fame of Jesus spread all over the country. Luke talks about it. There's 4 or 5 or 6 different passages that point us to seeing how Jesus became more and more famous. Mark chapter 1 says his fame spread. And so I don't know about you, but have you ever heard about or met a famous person who was just a jerk? You run into them and they're just they blow you off. They don't really care about you, and you're thinking, come on, and they're just rude and all. And you think about it. If Jesus was a celebrity and he was constantly, it says crowds followed him. How in the world did Jesus come across to the people he encountered? And maybe if we were to encounter Jesus, what do you think that interaction would be like? What do you think it would be like if one of us who, guess what? Scripture says that we are in Christ. And that means when people who maybe don't know about Christ meet us, it's as though they're encountering Jesus through us. So what would those encounters look like? What could we learn from the way Jesus dealt with the people he ran into? And so I thought, let's just spend a few weeks looking at different encounters that Jesus had with people and see what does that do? What can we learn from it? Both as a person who maybe is encountering Jesus, how would Jesus handle me if I was this? Or as followers of Christ, how do we deal with the people we meet? Are we able to present Christ to them in a God-honoring way? I read through the Gospels, and it's amazing. And these are just the major encounters, okay? These are one-on-one, pretty big deal encounters. There were almost 30 encounters that Jesus had with different people. And you can read through the Gospels, and I just listed them all out just to see what it was like. And then I started pulling back saying, okay, well, what can we learn from these? Are there patterns that we might see in the different people? And so I narrowed it down to about 4 different categories of people, and we may add on to it 2 more, talking about when he dealt with the disciples, right? The followers, how he encountered them and dealt with them. And then last of all, I'm hoping this works, we're going to talk about how Jesus encountered the nobodies, the people people who no one would even look at or take care of. And that week, if everything works right, the Christy Quist is going to be back from South Africa, and she will be able to share with us a little bit about what it's like to deal with people who are, by all intents and purposes, nobodies. So that's where we're going with the series. But I noticed 4 main categories that I wanted to deal with. First, I want to look at what it was like when Jesus encountered seekers, people who were seeking after the truth, just trying to figure out what it meant. Then talk about people who were strugglers. When Jesus encountered someone who was struggling, whether it's physically, emotionally, relationally, in whatever way, what was it like when he encountered those type people? I want to see what it was like when Jesus encountered sinners. I mean, just caught red-handed, so obvious these people were sinners. How did he deal with them? And then last of all, we're going to deal with what happens when Jesus encounters what I call somebodies. These are the people who have power or influence, or maybe they're wealthy, or maybe they're in the ruling class, or whatever it is. What was it like when Jesus encountered them? And so over the next few weeks, that's what we're going to look at, all these different types of people. And my goal each week is to ask some very basic questions. The first question that I want to ask is, if I met Jesus, how would he treat me? And then, do I treat people in these categories the same way Jesus did? Okay, those are the 2 ways that I want us to learn from these encounters each week. Today we're going to look at what happens when Jesus encounters a seeker. Someone who's saying, I don't know the truth, I don't understand, and I want to find out, I'm just not there yet. So what does that look like? We're going to actually look at 2 different people, and yet they're side by side in Scripture. John chapter 3 and John chapter 4. We have 2 people who are complete opposites in the socioeconomic standing of the day, and everything about them was completely opposite, except that they were both seeking the truth. The first one in John 3 is Nicodemus. And if you have your Bibles, please turn there. And let me just read a couple verses so you get a feel as to what's going on. And then I'm going to introduce you to the Samaritan woman, which is chapter 4. And then we're going to compare and contrast their encounters with Jesus and see what we can learn as followers of Christ. It says there in chapter 3, verse 1, "Now there was a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. We've talked about this before, but let me just quick review. A Pharisee was someone who, there were never more than 6,000 Pharisees at any given time, okay? So this was an elite group of men. I'm sorry, ladies, at that day it was only men who could become a Pharisee, which maybe later it's kind of glad because Pharisees didn't turn out that well. But they were the men who had studied. They probably had the Old Testament memorized. They, in essence, were the lawyers of the day, only with religious overtones, okay? So it was like religion and law all together, and they were the ones who could tell you how to interpret different aspects of the law. But this guy, he wasn't just a Pharisee. It says he was a member of the Jewish ruling council. Okay, this meant he was not only just a lawyer who was an expert in the Old Testament and how to interpret it and what to do with it, he had moved into the role of almost being like a judge. And probably even more than that, not just a judge, but one of the higher court judges. And I don't know how exactly to explain this, a complete comparison here, but I just happened to run into, I'm name dropping, but not really because this guy's not that important. But I happened to run into our newest judge, and don't worry, it wasn't in court. I just happened to run into him, okay? And I was introduced to this guy, and he's the newest 5th District Court of Appeals judge. And we just got to talk and sat down and chatted for about a half an hour, 45 minutes, had some mutual friends, so that was kind of cool. But I just asked him, because I am ignorant of our judicial system, thank God. And I don't know exactly how everything works. And then I just said, okay, how do you become one of these type judges? I mean, what does that mean? Because Kasich appointed him because a term was left open or something, I don't know. And he said, well, you start out, you got to pass your bar exam and you become a lawyer and you practice law. And then after a while, you may want to run for judge, a local judge, and you have to get elected. And then if you do really good in that, you can move up and try to run for a court of appeals, a circuit judge. And there's only 6 of them in the 5th district. And you have to run for that and be elected into that. And then if you're really, really, really good, you may at some point become a state Supreme Court justice. And then, of course, you can move on up through the federal ranks as well. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I get it now. And this guy, Nicodemus, was basically a lot like this guy I met, Craig Baldwin. He's just Real guy, but he was an expert in the law. He understood. He had risen through the ranks of, Phariseeism all the way up to becoming a judge in the ruling council. And so he was a pretty smart guy. And if you think about what was happening here, it says, this guy, he says in verse 2, he came to see Jesus at night and said. Now, this is a pretty important guy coming to Jesus. The only way I can compare this, in modern day, Jesus would be like a local radio talk show host who has quite the following, and everybody seems to like him, and he's very, very popular. Okay, he wasn't a member of the bar, right? He wasn't a Pharisee. He had no education that we know of. He wasn't elected to anything. He was not considered an official. He was just a guy who did some teaching and everybody really followed him. Now, can you imagine a Court of Appeals, circuit judge coming to this local radio host and saying, hey, I got a couple of questions about the Constitution and law. Could we chat a little bit? They're not going to do that, right? I mean, that's ridiculous. One, it would probably be tweeted and then on the internet, and then they'd lose their job or something. Who knows? But the bottom line is, this was not a normal thing to happen. And so this guy, Nicodemus, comes to Jesus, and it says he came to him at night. Now, different people have talked about, he was, worried, and he came at night because he was trying to keep it a secret, and I'm sure that could be the case. I also wonder if maybe he didn't come at night because Jesus always had so many people around him during the day. When are you going to get an hour alone with this guy to really talk some deep theology? You're not going to do it in the day when there's hundreds of people milling around always. Jesus keeps healing everybody, and everybody's, sick people walking away. That's not a time to talk. I think he came at night simply because that's when he could get some one-on-one time. And so he comes to him at night, and he has this conversation. And he opens it just by saying, hey, Rabbi, which calling him Rabbi was pretty significant. He's saying, you're a teacher. And as even a judge, I'm looking at you saying, you know what, you are more than just some talk show host. You're more than just some guy walking around spouting off things. You're from God. And he goes on, he says, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him. He says, I'm just here to learn. Tell me, what do I need to know? Okay, let's jump forward to chapter 4. Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman, right? And you know the story. I'm not going to read the entire thing. Let me just show you how it starts in verse 4 of chapter 4. Now, he had gone through Samaria. He had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar. Near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? Now, first of all, there's just so many things going on here. Just as Nicodemus went and talked to Jesus, and that was quite a social leap down for Nicodemus, right now Jesus is leaping way, way, way down socially to even open his mouth and speak to this woman. This is one of those things where Jesus sets his reputation aside and says, I don't care about that. I'm going to disregard my reputation because this woman is someone that I care about and I want to speak to. So he says, will you give me a drink? Now, why was this so significant? And we've all heard Samaritans and Jews didn't get along. It was a big thing. They didn't like each other. Quick history lesson, in about 721 BC, that's when the northern kingdom of Israel fell. Right? The Assyrians came in, they took a whole bunch of them off to Assyria, and then some of them they left there. Then they would also deport from other countries they had conquered. They would send them to this area to intermingle and it was really getting rid of an entire race of people is what they were trying to do. Trying to mix it down so much that they would stay true to Assyria because they didn't have anything else to be true to. Well, we know what happens about 300 years later, 445 to 430, in that range. we know Ezra and Nehemiah return from the exile, and they come to Jerusalem, the southern kingdom, Judah, and they start to rebuild. Nehemiah builds the wall. You can read about it in the book called Nehemiah. And Ezra, he rebuilds the temple, which you can read about in the book called Ezra. Okay, really, really complicated stuff here. And he comes in and they start rebuilding this. Well, there's an interesting thing. The Samaritans, okay, this group that had been, deported and brought in, and they'd intermingled, and all these weird things had happened, they say, yes, the temple's going to be rebuilt, because they're Jews, right? They have this heritage. And they come down and they're like, Ezra and Nehemiah, we're here, we're ready to help. What can we do? And they get rejected. Right? Ezra and Nehemiah and all the pure Jews look at them and say, no, you're inbreds, you're mongrels, we don't like you, we don't want you, you're nasty, you are defiled, you cannot be part of this. And they send them back. Now that we don't always hear that side of the story, do we? But can you imagine how ticked off this group became? And not only that, then one of the Jews, he was kind of a radical Jew, goes and marries one of the Samaritan women and rallies all of the Samaritan people and gets them together and says, hey, you know what? We don't need them. Forget them. Let's build our own temple. And so they do. And they kind of create their own religious system, their own processes, their own sacrificial system, and even their own priesthood. And they build this whole thing up. And so you've got the Samaritans with their own temple, then you've got the Jews with their temple, but they're both kind of Jewish, and so you've got this issue where they're really fighting, and they're not. Finally, about 300 years later, they come in. The Jews get just tired of it. They march up through Samaria and they destroy the temple, the Samaritan temple, and they just wipe out everything. Now, you can imagine the feelings there were not exactly, fuzzy at this point. They were not at all happy with anything. 120 years later, Jesus arrives. The only way I can describe to you the difference between the Samaritans and the Jews and the way they would look at each other, the Jews looked at the Samaritans the same way, kind of, that I believe post-Civil War white people looked at African Americans. Now, I'm not proud of that. That just is what it is, okay? That's history. They looked at them as less than, right? They weren't equal. And so that's how they treated them. And so the Jews would treat the Samaritans as less than. Now, to be a Samaritan and to be a female in the first century, I mean, I'm sorry, but you were property in those days. And that's rude, and it's annoying, and it's absolutely horrible, and it's an injustice, I agree, but that's just the way the first century was, okay? And you need to understand that as we understand why Jesus would interact with this woman. Because Jesus initiates the conversation with her. Think about that for a second. He says, could you get me a drink? And that's how Jesus encounters this woman. And as we go, we're going to learn she wasn't just a Samaritan woman, okay? She had quite the history. I mean, even among the Samaritans, it was noon. Okay, it's 123 degrees there at noon. You don't go out to do chores at noon in the Middle East. You do that in the morning and everybody comes together, but she comes alone at noon. She was shamed in her own community. So talk about two extremes. Nicodemus, ruling council of the Jews, Samaritan woman. We don't even get her name. And Jesus encounters both of them. Now look at what we learn from this. In John chapter 3, in encountering Nicodemus, what does he tell him? He says, very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of heaven without being born again. And of course, Nicodemus goes, I'm old. My mom's older. That ain't happening. Okay, sorry, but I don't get it. Jesus goes on and he says, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of heaven without being born of water and the Spirit. Now, here's the thing I want you to see. I know Jesus talks a little, metaphorically here, and it can be confusing, but I want you to see very clearly. He's saying, look, You've been trying to approach God through the law, really for generations, but you are a lawyer, you are a judge, you are the one who basically tells people how to approach God, and it's all about you and keeping the law and doing what's right, and you need to hear, you got to start over. You can't do it this way. You came to me and you kind of just opened the door and said, listen, you're a teacher, I'm here to listen. I'm not even going to ask a question. You talk, I'll listen. This is what you need to hear. You're starting from the wrong perspective. You got to be born again. You got to start over. You can't finish your journey from this point because you are too far down the wrong road. What does he say to the woman? Right? She starts talking and she says, how can you ask me for a drink? You know, this. And then she says, he responds to her, he says, listen, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, I'm in verse 10 of chapter 4, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. She says, whoa. Okay, you got no bucket. You got no rope. This is a 200-foot deep well. And you're telling me that you got better water than that somewhere? Listen, Jacob gave us this well. Are you telling me that you're better than one of the patriarchs? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And Jesus is basically saying, yep, I am. He says, everyone who drinks this water that your patriarch gave you gets thirsty again, right? That's why you have to come every day to get more. But I've got something for you that becomes a well within you. See, the problem is, he's telling her, listen, you're only seeing it from one perspective. You're all about how you can accomplish things, how you can make things better, how you can quench your thirst. What you need to hear is, you can't do it. That mindset that you are bringing to the problem that you have is not the right mindset. You have to start over. Two people, totally different lifestyles. One, he says, listen, you got to be born again. The other, he says, you got to come up with a new well, and guess what? I've got it for you. You got to start over in the way you think, in the way you approach salvation, in the way you approach the kingdom of heaven. Everything has to start over. Which is mind-blowing to these people. Because guess what? They've been entrenched in this for generations. But then Jesus goes on. Not only does he say you have to start over, then the next thing he talks about is, you know what, if you are going to enter the kingdom of heaven, and he tells Nicodemus that there's something else you got to do, you've got to face your own sinfulness. And here's how he tells it. He says, listen, you know, you're Israel's teacher, and you don't get what I'm talking about, but listen, let me put it in a way you can. Do you remember when the Israelites, and he's quoting from Numbers 21 at this point, he goes, do you remember when the Israelites were traveling? They were coming from Egypt to the promised land, and they were, you know, manna was coming down from heaven, that they had just reached this point where they had conquered a couple of other countries, and they were just really rolling right along. Do you remember what they did? Yeah, they started whining and complaining and saying, God, you're just not good enough, you're not doing it, we're really upset with you, and they're grumbling. And you know what God does? He sends venomous snakes into the camp. Now, anybody here like snakes? Like venomous snakes? Really wants one for a pet? Because if you do, you're weird. I'm sorry. Venomous snakes in the house, not good, okay? Now, can you imagine the camp is overrun with venomous snakes? People are dying. Okay, this isn't just some little, oh, that's a nuisance. No. You're dead if one of these things bites you. And so finally, the people go, oh, you know what? I think we did something wrong here. Maybe we should talk to God about this. And what does God tell Moses to do? He says, Moses, I want you to take a pole, I want you to take a bronze snake and put it on the pole and then put it in the middle of the camp. And anytime someone gets bitten, if they look at the bronze snake, they'll get better. They'll live. Now, if I was Moses, I would have said, God, I got a better idea. Why don't you get rid of the snakes? Okay, but that's not what he did. He says, no, because I want you to remember your sinfulness. Every time you look at that snake, all through history in the Old Testament, the serpent was always equated with wickedness and evil. Every time you look at that, you need to face your sinfulness. This is why you're in this predicament. You got to face that before you can move on, before you can live. And Jesus goes on to say, in the same way, the Son of Man must be lifted up. Now, why does he say that? Because listen, what do we see when Jesus goes to the cross? What is it that's hanging there dying on the cross? Is it the Son of God? Yes, but what has been put on him? What does Scripture say? He became sin so that we could live. Right? Our sinfulness was put on him when he was on that cross. So that means when we look at the cross, every time we look at it, we're facing our own sinfulness because it's right there staring us in the face. Now we know that the story doesn't end with just facing it, right? We know that Jesus died, but then he rose again. And we'll get to that in a second. But we realize we got to face it before we can keep moving. And that's why then in chapter 4, he's facing this woman, right? This Samaritan woman. She starts talking about, she says, oh, this is really good stuff. This is amazing. So Jesus stops and says, hey, I tell you what, why don't you go back and get your husband and bring him and we'll talk about this. She goes, I'm kind of between husbands right now. And Jesus says, yeah, you're right. You don't have a husband. You've had 5. And the guy you're living with now isn't even your husband. Now, we can surmise all these different things as to why and what that means. Was it the woman's fault? Were the men just being jerks? Was it both? Who knows? We don't. The bottom line is there were issues. And Jesus was looking at her saying, okay, listen, there's patterns here you need to face. Before we can take this conversation any further, we got to root out some stuff that you need to deal with. And here's the thing. She goes, no, okay, well, you're obviously a prophet because you knew this stuff about me. Where are we supposed to worship? Now, a lot of people think that she is just trying to just change the topic, right? Get out of it. And that may be part of it. But as I was reflecting on this, I'm thinking, okay, wait a minute. She's asking where the true temple would be. Remember, the history here, 2 opposing, competing temples, right? One in Samaria, one in Jerusalem. So she's saying, okay, where is the real temple? Where should that be? And what do you do at the temple? What takes place in the temple, in the worship service? Sacrifices. Why do you sacrifice? Why is the sacrificial system right there in the temple? To get rid of sin. She's saying, listen, you're right. I have messed up my life. So where do I go? Do I go to Jerusalem? Because they'll reject me. Ours up here, well, it's gone. I have no way of dealing with this. Where do I go to face my sinfulness? Because it won't be atoned for. And I'm in trouble. I got nowhere to turn now. If I go here, there's nothing. If I go there, I'm rejected. You're right. I have messed up my life. What now? See, Jesus said, you need to face who you are, the sinfulness that is you, before you can go to the next step. And that's where Jesus turns it, right? Because the last step is Jesus came to make this possible, to make salvation possible. That's what we see in these 2 encounters, because he says to Nicodemus, he goes, listen, the Son of Man came and must be lifted up so that salvation can come. And then we get the famous verses, right? John 3:16. Everybody knows that one. For God, right, so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. We say it real quick and we forget what it really means. And then the next verse that says, hey, guess what? And he didn't send him to condemn the world, but to save the world. He says, listen, you got to face your own sinfulness. But I'm going to make a way so that you can do that and reconnect with God. And what does he tell the woman? He says, listen, it's not about a physical location. It's about your heart. He says real followers of God aren't worried about a location. They are going to worship God in spirit and in truth. They will find forgiveness and atonement, reconciliation, not in a place, but in a person. And that's what's going to happen. And so Jesus takes these two people, right? And they're totally opposites. And he says, listen, you, Nicodemus, Mr. Smarty Pants, know-it-all, really powerful, all that stuff, okay? You come to me, and you're being humble and saying, you just talk to me. Just talk to me. I'll listen. And so let me just confront you right now. Your system isn't working. You got to face that. And then you're going to have to trust that what I'm about to do will be enough. So when you look to me, it'll be enough. And then he faces this woman who is the lowest of the low. Everybody hates her. Nobody wants her around. She can't be around people. And it's an absolutely horrible experience. She's been used and abused by men all her life, it sounds like. She's in a relationship right now that's probably totally one-sided. And she's miserable. And he says, listen, before you can really experience what I'm willing to give you, you need to face the bad patterns in your life and at least acknowledge them so I can step in and help you with them. Because I will. So what conclusions can we come to if you're a seeker, okay? What conclusions can we have for a seeker? A person who's saying, okay, I want to engage God. I do, but man, I don't know where to start. I'm coming to church. That's a big step for me. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to do stuff. How do I engage God? Well, a couple quick things you can learn from this. First of all, because Jesus initiated the process, right? Jesus came to us. Don't be afraid to bring your questions, your honest questions. He's not afraid to answer them. Okay? He's not afraid. You don't have to be afraid. Bring them. But he may tell you that ultimately you're asking the wrong question. He may say, listen, it's not about a location, right? It's not about a music style. It's not about the right scientific method. It's not about this, that, or the... It's about you and me and eternity. So don't be afraid to bring your questions, but be willing to listen when Jesus says, okay, that's a good question. It's not the right question. Before we answer that one, let's get to the heart of the matter and the right question. But then the second thing I want a seeker to hear is that Jesus won't give up on you. Here's how I know this, because Nicodemus, right? At the end, we don't know what happened that night. Right? It doesn't say, and Nicodemus kneeled down and prayed the sinner's prayer and got baptized and angels flew down. Nothing, okay? It just ends and moves on to Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman, right? We don't know. But then we see in chapter 19 of John that something did happen. Because in chapter 19 of John, Jesus has just been crucified. He's on the cross. He is dead. And this guy named Joseph of Arimathea comes and he says, I want to claim the body. I've got a tomb that I want to put it in. Okay, that's a risky thing because this guy's a criminal. He's condemned. Your entire reputation is tarnished if you have anything to do with it. But in John chapter 19, verse 39, guess who is right there with him? Who pays for all of the spices, all of the things used to prepare the body, which would have been pricey? Nicodemus, who came to Jesus at night. Years later, probably. Jesus didn't give up on him. Just because he didn't have all his questions answered, just because he didn't get it all together that one night, Jesus didn't give up. He stuck with him. So that means if you are an already convinced, okay, you're not a seeker. You were a seeker, now you're an already convinced, and you're saying, all right, I get it. I know this stuff. What do I do when I meet someone who's like this? Well, let's learn from what Jesus did. Move the conversations to what matters, to the eternal things, to the eternal question, to the heart question, to the relationship question. It's not about, do I have all the right answers? Because guess what? You may not be able to answer every question that a seeker brings to you, that anybody brings to you. But you can always point them to Jesus, who doesn't give up on them, who is willing to give up everything to be with them, and was willing to die for them. That's where you take the conversations. And then you ask them to make that leap of faith, saying, you know what, I'm going to step out and believe that. And then from that perspective, I'll engage my questions. Because until I say, Jesus, my life is yours, until I submit to him, guess what? I can't answer some of those questions. They don't make sense. And so the question that you got to answer today is, am I going to approach people with a mindset of, you know what, you got to get your act together before I'm even going to talk to you? Or am I going to approach them and say, hey, you know what, I can tell you're trying to find out the truth. I would love to walk with you in that process. I would love to engage you in conversations. I would love to just journey. I may not have all the answers. I may not be able to do it right. I may mess this up a few times, but guess what? I am here. And I'm going to walk with you through it because you matter that much to me, because you matter that much to God. What happens when Jesus encounters a seeker? He loves him. He reaches out and he cares for him. What happened when Jesus met you? He loved you. He reached out and he's not letting go. That's the God we worship. And today, as we just finish out our service, I want to ask you to, if this is the time where you're saying, you know what, I do need to engage Jesus in that. I got to face my own sinfulness. I never have. And I got to ask Jesus to take that because I got to look at that cross because that sin is biting me over and over and over, and I need to deal with it. Then I want you to pray. I'll be down front if you want to pray with someone. You can do it at your seat. Jesus obviously didn't care about places. But if you've already done that, and you're saying, okay, but I want to share this, then I want you, as we're singing, as we're just finishing up, I want you to think about one person that you know you need to just chat with, talk with, because they're asking questions, they're seeking, and you get to be Jesus to them. You write that person's name down. Ask God to bring them into your path this week.